infused charisma with charm. The heart of charisma is a particular kind of storytelling. There is this religious quality.
Is it possible to fully grasp the current political moment without understanding this religious impulse?
I love the leading nature of your question that totally anticipates my resounding no.
Arguably, you have a guru as a president.
Donald Trump, his political success is the fruit of a rather ingenious ability to tell several different stories at once. He paints a picture of a totally rigged system stacked against him. That has helped him build this empire.
It's super unfair of me to ask this. If you were to do a bit of predicting, this podcast is supported by Stewardship, helping Christians be the best stewards of the resources that God gives them.
Radical generosity has always been central to the Christian story. Stewardship helps make it part of your everyday life.
For over a century, Stewardship has been working with generous Christians and the ministries they support.
They help you give well and see your generosity make a real difference.
If you want to give generously and wisely, a Stewardship Giving Account makes that simple.
You can support over 12,000 registered charities and ministries with ease, and even build a balance to set aside funds for when the right moment or opportunity comes.
Discover more at stewardship.org.uk.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm Justin Briley.
And I'm Belle Tyndall.
And this is Re-Enchanting, the place where we aim to re-enchant a largely secular post-Christian world with the Christian vision of reality. We do it with Seen and Unseen. That's the website you need if you want to find out more about Re-Enchanting and all the things that are on offer. And we'll tell you a bit more about that towards the end of today's show. But for now, we have a very exciting guest joining us this week, don't we, Belle?
We do. There is nothing Justin and I love more than a returning guest, Molly, and you are today's. I'm so excited. So let me give you an introduction for anyone who didn't catch your part one, and I'm sure they'll be catching it straight after this. Molly Worthen is an academic and journalist who has spent much of her career chronicling the history of religion in the USA. She joined us, as I've said, for Re-Enchanting. It was 2 years ago now, which is just nuts, to tell us about her own unlikely journey to faith as an adult convert to Christianity. And today she is back to talk to us about her new book, her amazing, phenomenal new book. It's so great. Spellbound, which is charting America's love affair with charismatic leaders in religion and politics. And so today we are attempting to re-enchant, or actually maybe disenchant. I don't know. We'll see how we go. Charisma.
Charisma, yes. And we'll talk about what charisma is, obviously. Lovely to have you back, though. Welcome back, Molly.
I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a giant fan of your show.
Oh, well, bless you. You were one of the early ones. I think season 2. You joined us. So, and we don't often have people back. So this is special, Molly.
Wow. Okay.
You're one of only a handful of people who have come back for a second turn. No, it's genuinely so lovely to see you again. And we'll maybe reflect a little bit as well on some of the things you were sharing last time you joined us. But you'll know, as a fan of the show and a former guest anyway, that our opening question is always, what books are you currently reading?
I love this question. I always have a few things on the go. I'm reading a few biographies, a biography of William F. Buckley by Sam Tannenhouse, a biography of George Eliot by the British scholar Catherine Hughes. But I have to balance that and also balance my addiction to Christian apologetics, to very kind of rationalist treatments of the faith, with books on prayer. And I'm reading now, just for the second time, Hans Urs von Balthasar's book, Prayer, the Swiss Catholic theologian. And as soon as I finished it, I had to immediately start reading it again, because it's just so packed with really provocative, brief efforts to capture the uncapturable, I suppose. And he talks about how contemplation is both passive and active at once, and how to think about it as a posture of consent toward the presence of the Holy Spirit. And it's given me new ways to kind of think about that wonderful passage in Romans 8 where Paul talks about how when we struggle to pray, the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words, and what this means to kind of be at God's disposal, be in a state of readiness for the Spirit to pray through you. And it's helping me slowly see my like very nerdy study of the historical Jesus and the trustworthiness of the scriptures as a path toward a contemplative relationship with Christ, which is really not, I mean, it's probably not intuitive for anybody, but it's really foreign to kind of the way my brain works and my temperament. So I'm really getting a lot out of that book.
That's so interesting to hear. And I was going to ask you anyway about, how are things 2 years on since we last spoke? It was still fairly fresh, actually, your conversion. You'd only been baptized, a year before at that point. But it's from what I can tell, and the continuing conversations you and I have had occasionally in the intervening time, Molly, you are quite a sort of arguably sort of left-brained academic. You like to pull things apart and kind of, you like the logic of the apologetics way of approaching faith. Is it, and even reading a book about prayer, and arguably is still doing that, you're kind of getting into the nitty gritty of it. But does it help you to actually pray? As you said, that can sometimes be the practice can be a bit different to the theory, can't it?
Yeah, and Von Balthasar has this great line that really convicted me, where he says, don't think that reading this book is contemplation. Like what you are doing right now is spiritual reading, and that's lovely. But that's not
I hate
prayer.
it when authors say that.
No, this counts. Me reading counts as being spiritual.
I would like to think I'm at least halfway there. I mean, I think I am very. I certainly pray every day, and I think like all of us, I'm constantly in a feeling of wanting to be praying, and it really was encouraging to me to sort of rediscover the Puritans on this, because I have a lot of anxiety about not having the warm and fuzzy feelings that I think I imagine a lot of my fellow evangelicals have. But the Puritans helped me kind of reinterpret my feeling of God's absence as a desire for God that God that wouldn't be there if God didn't put it there. That the feeling of desire is itself a component of that relationship, and it that's been helpful to me. But I really struggle with the patience required, the willingness to sit and not have an end goal in mind, and I think that contemplation it requires, whether you are voicing prayers or not, it's such a different mindset than the mindset we're called on to have in kind of the speedy rhythm of modern Western life, that I find it a very steep learning curve, and I work on it a little bit every day, but not enough.
And the lack of measurability, right? So even the saying like I work on it every day, and I feel the same, and then it's like, oh, how do I even measure? No, I'm not supposed to measure progress. What? It takes so much unlearning. So much unlearning.
Yes, faith is the first thing I've really had in life where it doesn't submit to my usual framework of, okay, what is the end goal? What are the intermediate deadlines? What's my reading list? Right? It's not something I can execute and check off. So I feel that I trust that the Holy Spirit is rewiring me, because I can't do it myself.
Oh, Molly, that is so. I love hearing you talk about faith. I think because I too am like, if instead of praying, could I just read a book about praying and that be prayer? Like that's so me. So I love hearing you talk. Okay, so you are here this time to talk about your book, Spellbound. I have it next to me, so for those watching, look at this chunky beauty of a book. There are many wonderful endorsements at the back, but I'm just going to read one because it is from Tom Holland, who we love on Re-Enchanting. I mean, that's no secret. So he has written about your work, the great story of charisma in American history from Massachusetts Bay Colony to MAGA has never been more thrillingly told and never more learnedly explicated. That's a pretty great review.
High praise.
Yeah, one of my life goals was getting a blurb from Tom Holland. He was very kind
Was
to
it?
indulge me. Yes,
Well
yeah,
then,
absolutely.
congratulations.
Thank you.
What a great time to be alive. We are going to dig deeply into that book. It's so fascinating. And as someone who, I must say, a blind spot in my history is strangely American history. I don't know how that's happened, but I'm quite Eurocentric. So I'm reading everything as a real beginner. So it's such an enjoyable read. But firstly, how are you defining charisma in this book? And I know, Molly, just because I've read it, that I'm asking you the impossible right now.
This is a major reason why I wanted to spend some time learning about it, because I sensed that, it has a specific meaning in the context of theology, which we can talk about. But in the way we use the term in everyday speech, it has always struck me as a term we punt to when we are observing a phenomenon between leaders and followers that we don't quite understand, and so the meaning is very fuzzy. And I realize now that when I began the project, I was in a muddle myself. I confused charisma with charm. I thought going into this project that I would be writing about a lot of charming people who are really great at working the room, making you feel like the center of attention. I thought they'd all be really good looking, have sex appeal. I imagined it would be one amazing orator after another who just executed all of the tips that I got from my forensics coach in high school, without even thinking about it. And I couldn't have been more mistaken. Those skills and qualities show up here and there in the cast of characters I ended up writing about, but really more in the breach than in the pattern of things. The more abiding pattern that I noticed was that charismatic leaders are deeply polarizing, actually. They have a fair swath of people who adore them and find them compelling, but just as much, frankly, usually more people who find them not just uninteresting, but often quite revolting. And so I was fascinated by that deeply, kind of out of sync, paradoxical reaction that these people provoke. And what I ended up concluding is that the heart of charisma is a particular kind of storytelling. It's a relationship between a leader and followers, premised on the leader's ability to invite followers into a new narrative that makes sense of their suffering and chaos, their individual frustrations, and connects their personal story to a big transcendent narrative. I think as humans, we are storytelling creatures. That's just the way we organize information about the world. So to say that a charismatic leader is a storyteller is not to say that he or she is always making stuff up. I think there are stories based on reality, and there are stories that are based on a pseudo reality. But there are, I think, at any given cultural moment, there are people who are really feeling left out of, frustrated by the current stories on offer in the culture. The ways that institutions and elites are giving you a frame to make sense of your own situation. And so charismatic leaders come in and offer a story that's not just a set of kind of worldly policy goals, but really gives you a sense of transcendent meaning that lifts you out of yourself. And that so there is this religious quality to the charismatic relationship, even in contexts that might strike us as totally secular.
I was going to ask, I mean, my mind immediately goes naturally, as I'm sure many people listening and watching does, to potentially America's most charismatic person right now, Donald Trump, precisely because, as you say, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone loves him, and he is someone who absolutely splits the room in terms of, people seem to flock around him. There's an almost quasi cult-like sort of following almost for him, and others who just find him the most repellent person. What he isn't is boring. I mean, that's the point, I suppose. And I think charisma for me is you stand out, whether for good or ill. In a sense, it's kind of like you can't not look at this person, though. That seems to be one of the overriding characteristics. I mean, we'll maybe talk about Trump in more detail later, but why has the States, in a sense, always gravitated, and perhaps it just is human nature, to the highly charismatic leaders, whether they be political or religious?
I think the phenomenon of charisma points us to some pretty universal characteristics of human nature that I think you can trace in any culture and time. I think humans are religious creatures, and by that I simply mean that whether or not we affiliate with an institution of organized religion, we crave a connection to a transcendent story. We are wired to worship, to elevate a cause or an authority above and over ourselves, and we will find a way to do that, whether it's in church or some other place. However, the story I'm telling in this book is very much a peculiarly American story. And I think a major reason for that is that it is a story about the long aftermath of the Protestant Reformation and the way in which the Reformation kind of broke apart the Catholic Church's monopoly on charisma. Charisma, I think, in multiple senses of the term, and I don't want to romanticize the kind of top-down control of medieval Christendom by any means, but I think it's a helpful generalization to observe that across the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had a number of effective ways of dealing with people who claimed a special relationship to the transcendent narrative, a special source of revelation or relationship to God. They could funnel a would-be dissenter into his own monastic order, or if a lady prophetess is getting a little too voluble, we'll just pair her up with a responsible diplomatic father confessor, make sure she stays on the straight and narrow of orthodoxy, and it'll be okay. And that more or less worked. And then, on top of this, I think in medieval Catholicism, and this remains true, I think, in Catholic contexts today, there are so many highly managed doors and windows through which the average individual can reach out for contact with the divine. And this all gets scrambled in the course of the early 16th century. And if we just boil it down and take as our shorthand for this moment Martin Luther and his major insights, of course, he thought of himself as simply reasserting the proper authority of the Bible, over against what seemed to him to be a vast misinterpretation of the authority of church hierarchy, and also returning to his understanding of the biblical teaching on grace and God's capricious action to simply decide that we are justified regardless of what we do or do not do. But there's a way in which his insight contains this very individualistic seed in the emphasis of the Reformation on the core of what it is to be in right relationship with the divine being this internal personal thing, that is a relationship between your being and your creator, and it is not dependent on institutions. It is unmediated in an important sense. It was certainly not Luther's intention to unleash a kind of anarchic chaos of religious entrepreneurship in his idea of the priesthood of all believers. But there's a way in which that individualistic seed and that mandate to reach out and connect on my own to divine power, it takes on a life of its own. And that impulse, it kind of metastasizes in the context of America, especially in certain varieties of American Protestantism, the American evangelical tradition. But I think too, in the kind of the chaos of the mix of early generations of immigrants and the really quite unprecedented political structure that emerges after the American Revolution, which is unlike the new experimental relationships between church and state in revolutionary France and other contexts. In the United States, it's not a perfectly free market. In many ways, Protestantism still has privileges, but relatively speaking, it is this marketplace in which creative leaders who have a special confidence in their own ability to connect with the divine, and a read on the ways in which certain communities are perhaps frustrated with their ability to plug into that transcendent narrative, are really ready for a pitch. And so I do think there's a way in which the American context, both in the big picture of Western civilization and for reasons specific to more recent American political history, has been this hothouse of charismatic leaders, and also a place very friendly to the explosion of charismatic faith in the New Testament sense, in the sense of Pentecostal enthusiasms, trance, tongues, prophecy, right? So my book is kind of weaving both of those narratives together: New Testament charisma and that more political charisma.
Can I reckon I know your answer to this question, but it's a really interesting one. Is it possible to fully grasp the current political moment in the US and to an extent in the UK, but let's focus on the US, without understanding this religious impulse, without putting that into the equation, without, I think you call it a worship reflex, which is such a good phrase at some point. Because it strikes me, Molly, that everyone's trying to figure out what on earth is going on. And yet, is it possible to even come close to an answer without taking very seriously this religious impulse that you talk about?
I love the leading nature of your question that totally anticipates my resounding no. In many ways, my book is about the problems with what's sometimes called the secularization thesis. This expectation that as societies become more modern, more technologically advanced, higher degrees of college education and so forth, they will shed the primitive trappings of religion and accept a totally rational view of the world. And I think we've got a lot of reasons to be very skeptical of that. But I think that even as affiliation with organized religion has generally trended down over the past century, it's a mistake to conclude from that the religious impulse is vanishing. It's simply that the shorthand and the tools that scholars, outside observers have used for generations to try to track that impulse, poll data on church attendance and statements by a standard cast of religious elites, these tools just don't capture as much as they once did. And we have to get a little more creative in looking for where that religious impulse goes. And I think one reason why, certainly in the States and to some extent elsewhere, our politics have become so polarized and charged is because I think people have turned to politics for transcendent meaning. And so, a host of issues that a generation ago would have seemed issues on which reasonable people can disagree, ripe for compromise and kind of incremental progress. Now those have become loaded with a kind of existential meaning, and my identity is tied up in my opinion on the funding of public schools or healthcare, right? Because those are shorthand for my position in this kind of cosmic battle, and I think that's a sort of religiousification of the political sphere that helps us understand this.
We sometimes talk about the demonization going on in politics, but it almost is literally demonization of both sides, because it's seen in quasi-religious terms. That person is literally a spiritually impure demonic force because of the things they represent politically towards me. And I mean, you're certainly not the first person to reflect that here on Re-Enchanting, that politics has become the new religion effectively for a lot of people. And you can, see kind of quote unquote institutional religion go by the way, but it just pops up in a different form, Now, we should talk though about some of the, if you like, genuinely religious manifestations that have happened, in its varied history in the USA. Probably one of the places where the most different kinds of, religions, cults, different sects, different sort of, manifestations of Christianity have emerged over 250 years or so. We won't be able to cover all of this, and people need to obviously read the book for the big story, and it's told so well by you in the book Spellbound. But there are 5 specific kind of types, I think, of charismatic figure that you roughly sort of lay out in the course of the book. They are the prophets, the conquerors, the agitators, the experts, and the gurus. Kind of effectively chronologically, those 5 categories kind of cover kind of up to the present, if you will. We won't cover all of that, but I wonder if you want to sort of briefly sketch out what these 5 categories are, and maybe give us 1 or 2 examples from the book of people who perhaps fulfilled these different types of charismatic leadership over the course of the last couple of centuries.
My idea is that in each era of American history, a particular charismatic style, a type of charismatic storytelling has risen in cultural resonance because of its ability to speak and address the anxieties and fears and desires that are particular to that moment in history. So while there are some abiding patterns that run across the 4 centuries, to understand charismatic relationships in any particular moment requires really digging into the details of historical context. And there is a kind of pendulum swing between these different eras that alternate between eras in which there is a heightened appetite for tearing down institutions, destroying and seeking kind of a fresh start, to a more of an impulse to build and construct something positive, and that's a broad pattern I found helpful. So the first era, the prophets, is the era most tightly tethered to the institutions and practices and worldviews of Old World Europe. Prophets are critics of institutions who derive their authority from standing just far enough from the institution they are critiquing, so that their volleys land, but not so far that they are offering a totally alien message. And often their immediate success in leading a movement is brief, but it can have a long cultural tail. So I begin the book with the story of the Puritan heretic Anne Hutchinson, who in the mid 1630s in Massachusetts Bay, during the brief height of her career, she had the majority of the congregation of Boston on her side, endorsing her criticisms of most of the ministers who were, trying to negotiate that faith and works paradox in a way that would still give them the tools to goad people to go to church and live virtuous lives and submit to the authorities. And Anne Hutchinson said essentially, no, if you read the scripture and listen for the Spirit, you can expect direct communication that will give you assurance, right? The Puritans loved this word, assurance of your salvation. And I find myself hanging on to it throughout the book, because I think there's a way in which even if we think of ourselves as totally secular, we crave something like what the Puritans meant when they talked about assurance, a confidence that we are aligned with the direction the universe is pointing in, and there will be some kind of rectification of all wrongs at the end. And so even though Anne Hutchinson's career is relatively brief, once she becomes too powerful and the disciplinary machinery of the colony springs into action, she's put on trial and banished. She's killed in an Indian attack shortly thereafter. But if you think about the evolving character of American evangelicalism and this lasting emphasis on my sovereign right as an individual to expect that assurance from God, I really think that she gets kind of the last laugh. I'll say maybe a bit about the chapter, the section of the book on the conquerors. I write about straightforward conquerors in the political military sense. I write about people like Napoleon and Andrew Jackson, but I'm also interested in characters I'd call metaphysical conquerors. I learned so much from the story of the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith. He was someone who helped me first see that I was barking up the wrong tree when I was looking for charm, because there are interesting primary sources that give us a vivid picture of his encounter with early converts, in which it's clear he did have this interpersonal magnetism. He was tall for the time. He was 6 foot. He had these blazing blue eyes. One early convert talked about shaking his hand and feeling the Holy Spirit thrill her from the top of her head to the soles of her feet. But then you can find another account by a skeptic who said, I took one look at this guy and it was just obvious. He's a charlatan. He had these weird fat hands. I don't know why anyone takes him seriously. So what's going on there, right? And then the other aha moment for me was learning more about the early waves of conversions and how thousands of British Christians converted to the Mormon faith in the early years of the church through hearing the Mormon message from missionaries and reading the Book of Mormon on their own. So these are folks who never encountered Joseph Smith in person, but they decided to shut down their lives in Britain and move across the ocean to this tiny podunk town, Nauvoo, Illinois, on the banks of the Mississippi, to participate in their prophet's vision of the new Zion, sight unseen. What's going on there, right? Like, clearly we can't credit the interpersonal relationship because it didn't exist until they got there. That helped me see that while the leader is important because he is a key character in the story he or she is telling, the locus of charisma is actually the story. And that's why it can travel. And that's why it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for building a charismatic movement to have some mastery of the media technology of your era so that you can disseminate your message. But the heart of Joseph Smith's story was this story of spiritual conquest. I mean, he recasts in his Revelation, that becomes the Book of Mormon. He recasts the Western Hemisphere as this new stage on which God is doing this second act. He locates so many central pieces of the Christian story in North America. I mean, the Garden of Eden is in Missouri in traditional Mormon cosmology. And the first Mormons understood their project as one of bringing and living out this revelation in real conquest of the continent. They particularly had an eye on indigenous Americans, who they believed, because this is their place in Joseph Smith's account, were descendants of an ancient Semitic people, the Lamanites. And so evangelization of Native Americans was so central for early Mormons, because this was about reawakening, these people who are descendants of this, lost tribe of Israel, essentially, and assimilating them into the Mormon project. Mormons today do not generally speak in tongues. They're not known for kind of bursts of Holy Spirit infused enthusiasm. In fact, the church really put its foot down on those kinds of things, some more than a century ago. But the first Mormons spoke in tongues all the time, and they understood, these ecstatic experiences as divine gifts of indigenous language that would equip them to be missionaries among Native Americans. And Joseph Smith, brilliantly casts this in a vision of kind of cosmic conquest, in which the Mormon picture of the tiers of the celestial kingdom and what you can hope for if you commit yourself to the works that the church asks you to do is to essentially become a God-man yourself and have your own race of spirit children. It's the ultimate pioneer faith. And I think his success speaks to the appetite for not just political military conquest, but a kind of spiritual conquest. So that kind of takes me up through the first, the first part of the book, and I continue to try to intertwine the history of religious enthusiasm with the relationship between political leaders and institutions up through our own time.
This episode is brought to you by Stewardship, a Christian charity making generosity simple and intentional.
With a Stewardship Giving Account, you can support over 12,000 churches, charities and ministries, all from one place.
Discover more at stewardship.org.uk.
So it goes, so we've spoken about prophets, conquerors, there's then agitators, experts, and number 5 is gurus. And I would love you to tell us about that category, because arguably you have a guru as a president right now. So it's particularly interesting. So could you tell us a little bit about gurus and tell us why, or if he does, why Trump fits into that category in such an interesting way?
Yeah, well, Trump's in the subtitle, right? So he's gotta be in there.
He's got a feature.
That's right. The gurus, in many ways, there are patterns in our current charismatic age that resemble previous patterns. So this appetite for it and gaining authority by attacking institutions, offering people a story that legitimizes their feeling of being ignored and left out by institutional elites. Those are certainly things we can see in earlier eras. But in earlier eras of American history, those charismatic leaders were operating in what I'd call a healthier political and cultural ecosystem, in which the average American had derived a fair amount of identity and sense of purpose and a frame for understanding the world through relationships to institutions and traditions. And so when a charismatic leader came with a new story to offer, I think Americans in prior eras were better positioned to evaluate that story in the context of alternative claims. And that has fallen apart in our own time. We are, and this is connected to some broad patterns across the West, but I think it's pronounced in the United States. We are at a real nadir in Americans' trust in institutions. So if you take just one measure, 1958 was the first year that the National Election Study in this country asked Americans, do you trust the federal government to do the right thing all or most of the time? In 1958, 75% of Americans said yes. Today, that number is more like 22%. It's a little bit lower among Republicans, a little bit higher among Democrats. But then, if you look at polls that ask Americans a similar question about their trust in the whole range of institutions, from Congress to mainstream media to higher education, even the military, you just see a real drop off in trust in institutions. And at the same time, we are all we have this illusion of great autonomy and the ability to gather whatever information we want through the world about the world through our little glowing rectangles. When, of course, in reality, we are channeled into a pretty narrow track of information by the algorithms that seek to stimulate our dopamine receptors and get us to buy things and so forth. So we have this perfect storm of a attenuated relationship with institutions and this illusion of control and agency and the integrity of our own decision making that I think makes us particularly vulnerable to the play of guru figures who invite us to participate in these projects of tearing down institutions, while casting it in the frame of self-actualization and being our authentic self. So I think a big part of this narrative is the rise since the 1960s of this kind of pop psychology vision of what it is to be a truly complete, flourishing, happy person. Shed, any sense of duty and obligation that you have toward, traditional religions or institutions, and see instead that there is this authentic flame that is your identity inside you, and it is kind of timeless and immune from culture and history, all you have to do is unburden yourself and cultivate that flame. And the 60s psychologist Abraham Maslow coined the term self-actualization to describe this. I think it's a narrative that tells people essentially you can be your own messiah, you can save yourself, and that has proven to just not actually be true. And I think that the failure of that formula, that path toward happiness, has left a lot of people broken and searching and vulnerable for someone to just make sense of this and put the pieces back together. And there's this kind of spiritual void. So, I do think that Donald Trump, his political success is the fruit of, a rather ingenious ability to meet kind of several cultural needs at once and tell several different stories at once. He is someone who, from long before his formal entry into electoral politics, he was really good at telling a story about himself. So if you go back and read his interviews with tabloid reporters in the 1980s, or read, his first kind of famous book, The Art of the Deal, he talks at length about getting revenge on anyone who attempts to screw him over. And he paints a picture of, the world of real estate and finance as one of a totally rigged system that is, stacked against him. But he knows how to navigate the loopholes, and he sees the illegitimacy of this system and is not fooled into thinking that he needs to play by these illegitimate rules. And that has helped him build this empire. And we need to remember that prior to 2016, most Americans' picture of Trump was the picture from the reality TV show The Apprentice, in which, in those famous boardroom scenes, he is the portrait of cool, dare I say, quasi-presidential gravitas, and, calmly surveying the room of striving would-be entrepreneurs and saying, you're fired, in a totally measured, kind of emotionless voice. But it's one that came, after decades of telling this particular story about, the genius, wealth builder arrayed against the corrupt system. And that's a story that translated so naturally into a story he could then tell about the whole country and what he was representing, the grievances that he legitimated. I will say too, though, there's been so much speculation and hand-wringing among his critics about his relationship to Christianity, and how is it that so many Christians can support him when clearly he is not by any reasonable measure an Orthodox Christian. I think it's important to remember that he grew up going to church. He grew up going to Norman Vincent Peale's Marble Collegiate Church in New York City. Norman Vincent Peale, the author of The Power of Positive Thinking, the grandfather of the Christian variety of the prosperity gospel, this worldview in which the constraints of reality don't matter too much. You can will the reality that you believe the universe owes you into existence. Yeah. And indeed, if you succeed, and your wealth and happiness in this world is a testament to your cosmic virtue, that I think you could argue is one of the most influential streams of American spirituality. And it has been so since really the early 19th century. It has Christian and non-Christian forms. It's a story about the world that actually resonates, I think, quite a lot with many Americans. And it's one that Trump comes by naturally. And I think, too, it helped connect him with what has perhaps been one of his most important constituencies, which are these independent, charismatic in that New Testament sense, churches and evangelists. One of his closest advisors is Paula White Cain, who's an independent, charismatic. Well, she was a pastor. Now she has more kind of her own media empire based in Florida. And, I think it's a mistake to understand that as just a short-term alliance of political convenience, although it has some of those features. We need to remember that Paula White Cain and Donald Trump have been good friends since 2002, long before he was in politics, when he saw her show on TV and found her compelling and called her up, said he admired what she was doing. And, I think that he has a kind of natural affinity for this stream of Christianity that looks for the supernatural confirmation of righteousness in the world. Yes. And it's this, as a historian of Christianity, I'm so interested in the way Christians over the centuries have navigated this and tried to have the right relationship to spiritual power. And I'm struck by the way in which, much of the kernel of what people label as Christian nationalism, in its expression in kind of a Trump's constituency among these charismatic Christians, if you boil it down, a lot of it is just sort of Orthodox Christian teaching, right? Prophecies are if they're from God, they're actually true. Miracles happen. We can expect the Holy Spirit to move in the world. God cares about justice. This is all stuff like when they send out these surveys, when secular journalists send out these surveys trying to get a head count on the Christian nationalists in my country. I look at these surveys and I think any kind of normal Christian would actually assent to most of these things, right? The problem is that I think especially in these independent charismatic churches, there is this expectation of God's power, but it's disconnected from the discipline of tradition and institutions. These are really entrepreneurial, dynamic churches with very fuzzy checks and balances, if any at all. And that in combination with often a very urgent expectation that the end times are upon us and that God has infused the world with his supernatural action in a new way. It's kind of like, we're holding a much more powerful weapon than we're prepared for, I think.
Yeah,
and so, that has brought us to this difficult moment of, a certain kind of theological charge to politics, but it also helps us understand Trump's success.
It does, and there is almost, as you've expressed there, a kind of quasi-religious element to the way in which the MAGA thing has taken off. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about the background there of Trump kind of essentially being somewhat inculcated into a prosperity gospel type of model of Christian faith, and you can see how that kind of comes through maybe in the way he then does things. I mean, where I'd be fascinated, just because time's running short already, Molly, to kind of get a sense from you as a relatively recent person coming to faith yourself, but very well acquainted with the turbulent history of religion in North America. And seeing, these current dynamics going on, where does it leave you? Because, do you see kind of God working through all of these different ways, even some of the more negative ways in which things happen? And how do you kind of discern, I suppose, what is going on and what is truly of God and what isn't of God as far as you're concerned when it comes to these many different manifestations that have existed in the US of these characters, and also what's going on at a political level between the church and political figures like Trump?
Big question.
Yeah. And I'm still, I'm a spiritual infant. I've, been a Christian a little more than 3 years, so I'm still figuring out a lot of these things. I suppose I do find that coming to Christianity as a historian, so my frame of reference has always been the 2,000-year tradition, the sense of it being a global tradition, that I do think gives me some ballast and perspective, and I am more and more persuaded that you can't be a Christian by yourself. So you've got to find a place to stand, a community to worship with. But whatever community you choose, it will have certain aspects of our approach to God that it has an instinct for and a gift for, and then it will have blind spots, and you can't sort of stay parochial for too long, lest those blind spots, become second nature to you. So I think it's continually important to avail yourself of the whole of the tradition, and challenge yourself by reading and engaging with Christians outside, what you consider to be your lane, in order to see which aspects of your practice and faith are actually gospel and which aspects are culture. The other piece of being a historian is that, the more you study history of any kind, the more you're just overwhelmed by how terrible humans are in every period of history. And I often reflect on how, even before I was a theist, I had no problem believing in the doctrine of original sin. And it was the only satisfying explanation for the evidence, frankly. But at the same time, you see, as much as we are so different, across time and cultures, there are these abiding questions that humans are constantly wrestling with, and there is this sense of like existential fraternity, I guess I feel, with Augustine, right? When I read the Confessions, and I'm just struck by how so little has changed in some sense. And so that sustains me. I guess in a more kind of immediate sense, I'm hopeful as a result of my conversations with my students. I see them questioning the deal that 21st century Western modernity has offered them. I see them voluntarily shutting down their social media accounts and really questioning the role that their devices have in their lives. I'm super intrigued by the phenomenon that you guys are covering more assiduously than anyone else, of this kind of renewal of interest in traditional religion among younger people. And I think we're at a very delicate moment with that, and certainly some young Christians are taking that seed of hunger for existential and spiritual meaning in a direction of politics and tribalism, and so much depends on the mentorship, I think, that young Christians receive. And I feel that myself. I'm a midlife Christian, but I'm so dependent, I think, on my mentors.
And just to break in quickly there, one of the issues with the mentorship is that many people are being mentored by these very charismatic online figures now. Trump is kind of at the top of the food chain, if you like, but there's any number of other people who are kind of speaking in, and they tend to be these very charismatic figures who people follow and either love or hate or whatever. And yet it's all being, as you say, mediated by these little rectangles in our pocket. And to some extent, I think what a lot of churches feel is, or pastors, who don't have that celebrity status, is like, how can we compete, with that? So, and not that you necessarily have the answer to that, Molly, but what is it like that you would counsel to your students who inevitably are kind of just as much at the mercy of the algorithms and the influencers, be they good or bad, through their mobile phones?
Yeah, I worry that even those of us who are sincerely convicted by the Orthodox Christian picture of the world, we are so trained by our culture to operate as consumers, and to think of religious faith and practice as something that we can just do at our convenience. And I'm struck by the conversations I have with pastors who tell me, even my most involved devout members who tithe and so forth, they, maybe a generation ago, they would absolutely come to church every Sunday, but now, maybe best scenario is 4 out of 6 Sundays, and fewer in the summers when people are traveling, and they're much more willing to put their kids' soccer schedule above church. And these are even the faithful people, let alone the seekers. I think that there is a crucial set of habits that need to form early in a person's life. And on my campus, there is just a thriving world of Christian ministries that do get students off their phone dependence a little bit, and in any case into real live communities that they're opting into at a time when maybe a lot of them are inclined to view their path through university as how can I find the shortest path just to the credential. Those same students are actually seeking out intellectual, theological, spiritual community voluntarily. So I'm really encouraged by that. I mean, I think these interpersonal connect points are the only like viable antidote to what you're describing.
Yeah, I think what does seem to be happening, or at least what I'm observing, is because our existential yearnings, our religious impulse, our spiritual reflexes, feel like they're closer to the surface than maybe they were in generations gone by. What's also closer to the surface is the dissatisfaction when we sense that the wrong thing is receiving it, or on the receiving end of those impulses, which is quite interesting. I don't know if you find that, but I've found that quite interesting. So, there's a lot of tearing down happening, which I guess also goes with in hand with your point of like distrust in things. So for I think a lot, I write a lot about like romance and romantic love and things like that, which is where so much of my generation channeled their like their reflexes to worship and their religious kind of inklings and things. And now we have what we're calling the dating crisis. We're all like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That was never designed to receive what we gave it, because it was never designed to give us what we wanted from it. And so that's quite an interesting shift I'm observing. And all of that to say, Molly, I was wondering, as a historian, and like you say, your book kind of charts this like pendulum swing. It's super unfair of me to ask this of a historian, but if you were to do a bit of predicting based on the patterns of the past and then reading the patterns of the moment, is there anything that you're like, oh, I predict things might swing this way? Or are you able to plot where we are in that pendulum swing, do you think?
Boy, I would love to think that this spark of interest in reconnecting with religious institutions tells us that we have hit peak guru, and we are beginning to come out of it. I mean I would like to think that's true. I guess I'm not temperamentally. I'm very cautious about optimism, and there's some ways in which our civilization can't unlearn the the reasoning process that is now so deeply ingrained, in which the absolute first the alpha of any reasoning and judging of value and how we should move through the world begins with this idea of the self that is just so radically individual, and I think it's very hard to. It's one thing to come to terms with our disappointments in the picture of freedom that tells us that freedom is primarily a matter of shedding duties and obligations. We feel that to be dissatisfying, but it is so hard to move from that to actually entering a new posture in which we are taking on obligations, and we are submitting. We're not just treating religious and philosophical traditions as resources for our own self-optimization, but we actually are submitting to them. And even in our doubting, skeptical mindsets, we are joining a community. I mean, one thing that I find encouraging, I have heard often from evangelists and pastors that it's hard to get, especially young people, to care about what are the classic apologetics questions. Did the resurrection happen? Is Jesus who he says he is, and so forth? Because really, people are concerned in our postmodern culture about whether Christianity helps them optimize their lifestyle, and does it quote work for them, right? And there's some truth to that, but I've been struck. I mean, I've kind of developed a sideline of apologetics work, I guess, and I've been doing these regular apologetics Q&A nights with my pastor at our Christian Study Center on campus, and I work with the Veritas Forum that does things in this vein too. And I've been struck by how many young people actually want to know simply what's true. What is the true picture of the universe? And they're actually interested in those questions, those supposedly old-fashioned modernist questions that we've all transcended, which is tonic for me, because I don't know, I have felt like my conversion was incredibly cerebral. I'm sort of like a younger female version of Lee Strobel. Like I'm very interested in these questions of historicity, and I find I'm like less alone than I thought, and I sense, at least on my campus, a healthier attitude toward doubt, and an understanding, which I'm still trying to assimilate, because we all crave certainty, that in fact doubt is a healthy part of spiritual life, and it ought to exist, whether you're an atheist or anything. And part of the problem in our culture is a lack of understanding, how spongy your presuppositions are. Right? You think they're firmer than they are. But I'm really encouraged by the open conversations I have with students in office hours, about how to sort of bring your doubts into the Christian community, rather than thinking that they are a thing you've got to resolve before you can begin to be a Christian.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, actually. I think sometimes we can oversell the idea that, people are no longer interested in the classic apologetics questions of truth. It's all about the feelings and so on. And I'd agree with you. I run into a lot of young people who are still very interested in that, but it's partly because the ground has shifted somewhat, I think, because it's no longer uncool to be sort of even asking those questions. It kind of opens up the possibility of a lot of, for where that was always going to be a question for someone, they feel encouraged to actually ask it and explore it in perhaps ways that they didn't, a couple of decades ago, in the same way. It's been so interesting having you on. Thank you so much for the time you spent with us, Molly. My final question, a bit of a cheeky one, is, I'm guessing you think Jesus maybe was the archetypal charismatic kind of leader. What does Jesus' example, though, of being charismatic in that sense show to us, do you
Yeah.
think?
Is Jesus a guru?
A prophet, a conqueror, an agitator, an expert, which
Yeah, put him in a category, Molly.
Yeah. Well, I think so. There's a useful way, someone outside the Christian tradition can think about Jesus in the framework of my book, and then there's the Christian answer. I would say one of my main points is that to understand charismatic figures, we need to look at the anxieties of the time, right? And so, you think about first century Palestine under Roman occupation. It was a time in which there were a lot of self-declared prophets and messiahs running around, earlier than Christ, Judah Maccabee, who died at about 160 BC, very much presenting himself as a worldly savior. So in a sense, right, broadly speaking, Jesus was of a type. In a broad sense, he was speaking. He helps us understanding his ministry, points us to features of the hungers and desires of his era, and he was saying, I am the way and the truth and the life, right? So our guru alarm bells should be ringing there. Here is someone, one of the features of gurus is that they set themselves up as the authority, the doorway. They have a relationship perhaps to some tradition, but they are the arbiter, and everything comes through them. The question to ask then is, what is the picture of reality this guru is painting? Do I have grounds to believe that the story he's telling, that the story he's inviting me into, is the true story? And Christians would say yes. And I think we each, God shows himself to us in a range of ways, and none of those ways are coercive, right? There is no slam dunk, spiritual experience we are all given. There is no magic argument for the reliability of Scripture that silences all doubts. But he invites us into a story that if we investigate the evidence, we have reason to believe that the leap of faith into the story Jesus is telling is just as reasonable, and I would argue more reasonable, than the leap of faith that is required to sustain the other worldview options. So yes, Jesus is a guru, but he's the real guru.
He's the original guru.
Yeah, with Jesus, his followers are not spellbound, to come full circle, in that way. Oh, Molly, this has been so much fun. I knew it would be, and it was. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to say as well, if anyone perhaps is only hearing Molly here on the show for the first time, do go and check out her appearance in season 2 of this podcast. And we'll maybe post a link to that as well, so you can find that easily from your podcast or YouTube link, because Molly's own story of how she encountered the story of Christ and the search from the evidence and so on is a really interesting and remarkable one, and you'd definitely benefit from that. But yeah, thanks so much for coming back again, Molly, and this amazing book will obviously also make it available from the link so people can read for themselves.
Terrific. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you for listening. Just to say also, there is an extract of Molly's book that we have published on Seen and Unseen. If you want to whet your appetite, you can find that there. The other thing you can find on Seen and Unseen, if you /give, is details to make more conversations like this happen. You make Re-Enchanting happen, and we're so thankful that you do, because we love having these conversations. But that is all from us. We will see you next time.